Every leader knows that a thriving organization depends on the energy, productivity, and commitment of its people. But few leaders are able to cultivate the employee engagement and performance needed for this level of success. What's the difference? Positive leadership practices. Welcome to the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast with your host, positive work culture expert, Alex Bratty. Ready to harness the power of positive leadership? Let's dive right in.
Hello and welcome to episode 48 of the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bratty, and today we're diving deep on a very important and timely topic, and that is conflict resolution. It seems like we're dealing with so much conflict these days, and as leaders, it can be so challenging to know how to handle it all effectively. And that's why I've asked today's guest to be on the show. Charmaine Hammond is the expert in conflict resolution, and I feel so honored and grateful to have her on the show so she can share her wisdom and actionable methods with us today. So let me tell you a little bit about Charmaine, and then we'll get into what I know is going to be one of those conversations where you're probably going to have to listen twice because it's so jam-packed full of golden nuggets. So as I mentioned, Charmaine Hammond is an expert in conflict resolution. She started her career behind bars. She was a correctional officer, yeah. And then she got certified as a mediator with Masters in Conflict Analysis and Management. Charmaine has facilitated some of the most complex, challenging, and long-standing workplace and business conflicts for her clients. And she now teaches leaders, executives, and employees how to resolve conflict with courageous dialogue and a 5-step roadmap. So welcome, Charmaine. It is so wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I could talk about conflict all day long.
Yeah, and you know what? We've had this one on the books for a while, and every time I've seen it on the calendar, I'm like, oh, I'm so looking forward to that conversation because it is just so needed. I mean, your area of expertise is, I mean, it's always been important, but now more than ever with everything that we're dealing with between the pandemic, racial unrest, I mean, just everything, just even, you know, the political feelings that are running high with the election. I mean, it just feels like conflict is happening in all aspects of our life. So I am excited to dive into this with you.
Me too.
Yeah. So just to get us started, because I ask everybody this as the first question because, hey, it's the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast. What does positive leadership mean to you, Charmaine?
I love that you asked that question. To me, positive leadership is really about leaders knowing when to lead and when to follow. And for many leaders, the following part is really uncomfortable. It's also not about perfection. And the reason I created that definition for myself was many years ago, I was facilitating a team building process with a government department, and it was a new leader, not new to the organization, but new to that team. And he was so focused on having all the answers, being all things to all people, and having things be perfect. And when things fell apart and unraveled in the team, and he said, I just don't know what to do. And one of the team members jumped up and she said, you have 15 people around the table that can help you. And I thought, oh, and he allowed the vulnerability to happen. So that's the other piece of positive leadership. It's taking people where, you know, they sometimes don't want to go. Conflict, we see that all the time. Most people don't want to deal with it. But taking people where they may not want to go, but where it's really important to be for the team and for them as individuals. It's not about perfection. It does involve vulnerability. And it's about knowing when to lead and when to follow.
Oh, I love that. And what a powerful story. What a powerful moment for that newly minted leader, right? Like talk about learning moments in your career. I'm sure he will remember that forever.
Well, I ran into him about 7 years later, and he talked about that very same moment. And he said, you know, he said that while it was terrifying for him to admit to his team that he didn't know how to solve what was going on. He said it was the most freeing thing that he had ever done as a leader, because it allowed people to step up. It allowed people to take ownership on the team and share the responsibility. But the big learning came after I left that day, when one of his staff came to him and said, "Thank you for what you said at the meeting. You've now let us know that perfection is not required of all of us." And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "When you don't ask us for help, you've set a tone that it's not okay to ask for help. So we're not asking each other for help." And I thought, wow, that is powerful. And kudos to that team member who had the courage to go and say that to her supervisor. A lot of people would just let that go.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, that took courage for her to do that, especially when you consider the dynamic that she described previously. So it sounds like that was like a watershed moment for everyone in the room. And what a wonderful kind of reminder about how much self-awareness we need to have as leaders, and that self-awareness doesn't necessarily come from looking within. Certainly it can, but it comes from allowing the people around us to reflect back, to tell us their feedback, to let us know, because clearly that leader was a little blind to the sense that he was projecting, you know, if I'm projecting that I must be perfect, that's, he wasn't realizing like the ripple effect that was having on his team, which was detrimental. Let's face it, if we're not asking each other for help, that's detrimental to teamwork. And he didn't realize that. It took her coming to him to sort of shine the light on that and make him realize, oh, okay, I really have influence. Like being a leader is really a position of privilege. And sometimes we forget, because we get so caught up in our own whatever, that every moment we're having an influence on the people around us, for better or for worse. And so the more mindful we can be about that, that hopefully the more positive influence we can have. Wow, what a powerful, powerful story. And I mean, you raised such an interesting point here about leaders knowing when to become followers, because how counterintuitive does that seem, right? Because as leaders, we think we do have to have it all figured out. So, I mean, tell us, can you unpack that just a little bit more and say, like, when should a leader become a follower? And like, what does that actually look like?
The first time I learned that lesson, I was younger than 20 years old, working in a jail. And I was the same age as the youngest inmate. And when you work in a jail, people test you. That's part of what they do to new employees. And I was being tested quite quite severely by a couple of inmates. And I actually didn't handle it very well. My supervisor, his name was John, he came up to me after he did the whole, we need to have a talk. And he said, you know, you are letting what they're saying, how these gentlemen are saying it, land on you, and you are reacting, you are judging. This is not good for anyone. And he said, you need to fix that. And so I thought, how do I fix that? And so he sort of took me through this process where he was leading me, then he was following me. So he guided me with what I needed to do to actually deal with the situation, maintain my dignity, you know, set up an environment where there could be respect. And so he guided me through that, and then he allowed me to lead it. And I said to him later, I remember talking to him in the office, and I said, because a couple of times what I wanted to say wasn't quite coming out the right way. And I would look over at him and I was waiting for him to intervene. And he said, no, this is your part. You know, you're bumpy, messy, whatever it is, this is your part. And I just, you know, I was young then. And I remember thinking, oh, I just want you to fix it. And years later, I thought that was the biggest gift anyone ever gave me. Yeah. Because, you know, it really, and the relationship for me, this is my, you know, my first career. And he really taught me a lot about leadership and about the human component of leadership and letting people struggle. And that's what he allowed me to do. He allowed me to be in the midst of this messy conversation and struggling and handling my discomfort. And a lot of leaders would jump in and rescue the person. Nothing awful was happening. It, you know, it was awkward, but it wasn't awful. And he let me be in that moment of struggle, because he said that moment of struggle will be your biggest lesson for anything else you have to deal with. And he was absolutely accurate with that.
Oh my gosh, what an amazing boss you had. And
I know.
and maybe, as you said, because you were so young, I mean, my goodness, right? Like less than 20. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't know anything at that age, right? Like,
Thought
we
I did.
We do, right. We think we do at the time. And then, 10 years later, you're like, oh boy, did I know nothing
Exactly.
then,
Yeah.
So you probably didn't even realize at the time just how fortunate you were to have a boss and a leader like that, because, they're less common than we would want, right? But that's amazing. So he helped you build some resilience there, right? Like having to deal with that struggle yourself.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Where the lesson became super apparent to me. I mean, it became apparent to me as I went on and did my job, but about 7 years later, I was in my first leadership job. Probably not quite ready for it, but I was in it. And I was struggling as a leader, and I wasn't looking at when to lead and when to follow. I just led. And it was landing me in a lot of kind of bumpy conversations. And I remember John's wisdom, and that really helped me turn things around as a new young leader as well with the team that I was working with.
I love it. I love it. So, okay, bridge the gap for us in the story. How did you go from, working in a jail to doing what you do now by deciding to become a mediator? I mean, was it something that you observed in that jail environment? Like, how did all of that, tell us about that evolution in your journey.
So the bridge was that working in corrections, we dealt with conflict all day long. I mean, probably 80% of the day. The easier conflicts were conflicts with the inmates, because we had a job to do and we had all kinds of supports. The tough conflicts were conflicts within our own team. And I realized that we were not well trained. The training now that correctional officers get is way better, but way back when, we didn't actually learn skills to resolve issues within our team. And when I left working in the jail setting and then started to look at my next career, I went back to school, got trained as a mediator, went back and got a master's degree, and opened up a dispute resolution company. And the bridge from that was this passion of mine that, conflict, when it's well managed, it can absolutely transform people's lives and the team and the way in which we work together. And that's why I went back to school, to learn how to do this differently. And then when I opened the mediation practice, initially I started out doing mediation in family and community disputes. So conflicts between parent and teens, conflicts between couples who were separating, and conflicts within communities. And then I really found my interest in working on workplace disputes and conflict, and that's where I specialized.
What a fabulous journey. I love it. So, so tell us, I mean, break it down for us. Like, I mean, we all deal with conflict, and actually, I mean, your journey itself, reminds us, I mean, conflict is in all parts of our life, right? Whether it's parent, child, with a spouse or a partner, at the workplace. I mean, we run into it. We're all human beings. It happens. So like, what makes it so difficult to deal with conflict? Because people often try to avoid it, right? Or play it down, or kind of go in denial, or, everybody sort of has their own way. So like, why is it that it's so difficult to deal with?
A lot of it comes from the history, the way in which our families dealt with conflict. So a friend of mine, he was actually one of the mediators that I work with, his family just yelled. When they had conflict, they'd yell at each other and scream at each other. And so when he would hear yelling and screaming, he would find himself just feeling incredibly uncomfortable, or just wanting to get in there and solve it and fix it and end the drama. Then there's other individuals that come from families that are really good at avoiding conflict and sort of going around it. So history plays a big role, but history also plays a role based on the types of conflict that we've dealt with in our past. Because what I've noticed, and I've mediated, I don't mediate anymore, but I've mediated with thousands and thousands of people in hundreds and hundreds of workplace conflicts. And the patterns that I saw were people often avoided conflict because they were afraid of making the situation worse. They didn't know how to start the conversation. They had a past conversation that didn't go well, and that mindset is now shaping this conversation. And conflict can make us feel really vulnerable. To really resolve conflict, we have to be open, honest, integral, and vulnerable. And for the majority of us as humans, it's uncomfortable.
Oh, isn't it just? In fact, I was just talking with a colleague about vulnerability and how important it is in leadership to be vulnerable. But I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. I still struggle with it. You know, vulnerability it's for me at least, it is a hard concept. I mean, I'm working on it every day. I'm trying harder, but yeah, it can be that scary place where you really kind of have to put yourself out there and just trust that being authentic, opening up, telling people, you know, what's going on with you, that is going to be part of the bridge to make things better. But that can be a scary thing, right?
Yeah. It's, you know, and conflict is costing companies so much money. When I do training in organizations, we have an exercise that we go through where they actually measure mathematically, they measure the cost of conflict. And it's generally disturbing and very uncomfortable for a company to see how much revenue is leaving that building, that team every day. And the research is showing that on average, employees, team members, lose about 2 hours a week related to conflict. So if we think about that, that's either we're worrying about it, we're gossiping about it, we're being subjected to someone else's conflict, being pulled in, or we're resolving and addressing and dealing with the conflicts that directly involve us. So it takes a lot of time and energy to be in conflict and not be resolving it. And then we've got the side that, you know, we're uncomfortable, so we avoid it. When I think about the very first question you asked when we opened up this conversation about positive leadership, I would add that positive leadership is about being able to have what I call courageous dialogue, which is the conversations that matter most and are mostly avoided.
Yeah. Ain't it true, right? The conversations we should be having are not what's happening. And I mean, you make such a great point about the cost, right? And it's, you know, it's great when these studies translated into actual dollars, because then there's like an actual hardline business cost, you know, and a business case for dealing with it. And that's very helpful for leaders to sort of justify, you know, we need to deal with conflict resolution. But the other part of that, like what's also, I mean, there's a human cost to this too, right? And you mentioned it. I mean, people are spending time either worrying about a conflict that isn't resolved or how they're going to resolve it. And the energy that's required to do that, like there's other research shows that when we're in that space, it actually deteriorates our cognitive abilities.
Absolutely.
So we're not able to actually do our jobs effectively because energy is being drained from us by this conflict thing over here. And so it's like this downward spiral of just like one bad thing begets another. It's like the less we deal with it, the worse it becomes on so many different levels, like psychologically, monetarily, emotionally. It can even physically, right? When we don't deal with things like this. So,
well, and then there's a ripple effect that employees, when they're struggling, when leaders are struggling with conflict in the workplace, then there's also the impact on the family, because then they're bringing that home and it's impacting family, and it's completely impacting resilience as well. And I do a lot of speaking at safety conferences, and the reason why is because just what you've just said, that with conflict, when it's not been well managed or when it's being avoided, it can really increase the likelihood of near misses and safety accidents and infractions in the workplace, because people are distracted. And so I love it. I was having a conversation with an HR representative lately, and she said, I don't get it because we've all got these policies. And I said, oh, I can probably guarantee what your policy says. It probably says something like, if you have a conflict with another person, first resolve it with them. If you can't resolve it with them, bring it to your supervisor. Therein lies the problem, is that people don't know how to approach the conflict. And the majority of workplaces, by my own research, 75% of the workplaces that I've worked with or trained or spoken in front of have not had more than 2 to 4 hours of conflict training ever. And leaders are spending 40% upwards, 40 to 60% of their time related to conflict. And most of them have not had more than 4 hours training. And so they're expected to deal with this. It's taking up time away from their other job. And not every leader is feeling confident in A, their own abilities to manage it, and B, how the company, the culture will support that. And, so I really suggest to leaders, a great place to start is really looking at your policies and supporting your policies with procedures and training, and not just say, talk respectfully to each other, providing people training on how to get the conversation going in the first place.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
So
like, how do we
doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to happen.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, you're out there, you're working with a lot of companies. Like, what are you seeing at the moment, sort of, with this backdrop of the pandemic, the social unrest, the election? I mean, and I'm sure there's other pieces, but like, are you seeing that, there's more that sort of these social influences, are they having an impact on the level or the type of conflicts that you're seeing right now?
You bet. Definite in what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing about, whether it's from leaders, team members, HR, company owners, the similarities that I'm seeing across the board are that old issues are resurfacing. And we know this to be true because when we experience crisis, whether that be in a relationship, our community, our workplace, or home, when we experience crisis, what existed before gets worse. And I used to see this all the time as a mediator. And so with what you've described around what we're all living with and navigating through right now, there's many crises that people are managing just based on what's happening in the world. And so what existed for them is going to intensify and get worse, which means conflicts that existed in the team before that weren't well managed or weren't addressed are worse. But the other thing that's happening, and this is really perplexing for a lot of leaders, new issues are rising. And many of the leaders and HR folks that I'm talking to say they feel petty. They feel like little issues. And I'm hearing things like, why don't they just get over it? Or why don't they just, it's not a big issue. And the issue might not be a big issue, but it's being inflamed by everything else that's going on. So I'm seeing that. The other I guess, dynamic that I'm seeing, so we've got old issues that have gotten worse, new issues that have emerged, and the difficulty of not being able to address them effectively, because in many workplaces, they're not all working together under the same roof right now. We have remote employees, we have, shifts coming in and out, so people are physically distancing. A lot of things have been canceled, so things like that are really important for an organization, like training. I just talked to one company, and in the last 6 months since COVID, they used to meet every Friday. And I asked, oh, how are your meetings going? I made a gross assumption that they were continuing. Yeah. And they said, oh, well, we haven't had one since we closed up the shop. And I'm like, that's 6 months. So people are feeling incredibly, in many cases, disconnected. Yeah. And so some leaders are feeling like little cliques are forming within their team.
Right. And when we feel disconnected, we're even less likely to try to be vulnerable, right? It's like the shield goes up. Like, exactly. I'm not connected. I don't feel the trust. I don't feel the safe environment. Like, I feel like it's sort of me versus the world. And so
Yeah.
up goes the shield, right? So to even try to begin the conversation is even harder. I hear you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we've talked a lot about, I mean, the impact of this and just how crucial it is to deal with, especially right now, and these, you know, additional issues surfacing. Talk to us a little bit about solutions though, right? Because you have this very cool roadmap for resolution that we mentioned earlier. And I think you talked about having courageous dialogue. So,
Yeah.
you know, tell us about sort of, you know, walk us through that. Show us how we can actually, you know, pivot and let's focus on the solution here. What can leaders do?
So one thing leaders can do is checking in with people on your team, asking them, just having conversations around how things are going, fostering dialogue, letting people know it's still okay, letting them bring issues forward. So are there issues that need to be dealt with? Are there challenges that you're experiencing? And having that conversation, because that modeling piece, how leaders show up in tough times, is such an opportunity for people to learn from how that leader is showing up. The second thing that I would suggest is, as a leader, if you were seeing or hearing or sensing that conflict is sort of surfacing in your team, deal with it sooner. There's a great quote by Judge Esty. I have no idea who Judge Esty is, but I love the quote. And it says, conflict is not like wine. It
Yeah, that
doesn't,
is good.
it doesn't get better with age. So deal
No.
with it quickly. Imperfect, action is better than just letting it slide and hoping that it's going to get better. But the other piece you can do is the roadmap that you talked about. It's a 5-step model that I have. I'm happy to share this with people. The 5-step model really focuses on, first of all, preparing, then setting the stage for success, creating the agenda, having the conversation, and creating solutions. And where I see people struggle the most in conflict resolution is getting the conversation started. And this is a great opportunity for leaders when you're hearing people on your team talk about disagreements or challenges they're having with other people on their team. This is an opportunity for leaders to step into coaching role. And instead of advising someone of what to do and how they should do it, because they, if they don't have the confidence and they don't know what to say, that kind of advice actually won't foster that team member going and having the conversation. So what you can do instead is do things like role play and invite them to practice their skills on you. I have a strategy whenever I teach conflict resolution. Doesn't matter who the audience is. I teach them a great process of preparation. And this is key because the majority of conflicts, people go into the conversation with no preparation. And they just kind of wing it. And it shows in the results. And the best thing we can do is prepare, which means we have to consider what we're thinking about. What are we thinking about that person? How much are we letting past drive the current situation? And what assumptions have we made? And then the second thing we need to do is reflect upon, what is it I need to tell the other person? So if you and I were having a disagreement, I would be thinking about, what is it that I need to tell Alex? What do I need Alex to hear from my perspective? And then I'm actually going to go and write the points down on a piece of paper. And then I'm going to go into a room that has a mirror and practice it. And I'm going to practice what my conversation would sound like with you, Alex, at least 10 times. And I'm not going to worry about what Alex will say because I have no idea what you're going to say. I'm just going to focus on what I need to say and get it right, reduce the drama, reduce the emotion, so that when I get into the real conversation with you, my confidence is higher, I'm more clear, there's more congruence, and a way better chance for success. And leaders who even just teach employees that skill is extremely powerful.
Yeah. And I mean, and so applicable, by the way, to every other function in our job. I mean, preparation is kind of the key to success in anything, right? I mean, yes, in this particular instance, of course, but I mean, just taking that time to get real clarity about what you want to say, the points you want to make, and then, as you said, rehearsing it. And I mean, is it okay if someone takes their notes into the room with them so that they
Yeah.
don't forget? I mean, is that
Yeah.
still okay?
Yeah. And I always think it's so important to be transparent. So if you were taking your notes in to talk with a colleague or someone you're in conflict with, I would just say something like, I just took some notes to help keep me organized. And I know when we're having conversations that are uncomfortable or challenging, there's a tendency that they can go, go down a different path. And I just really want to focus on this conversation with you, Alex, and you and I working together to resolution. So that's what my notes are. I just wanted to be fully transparent with you.
Yeah.
And then what you've done right there is you've actually acknowledged something that's probably already creating distrust. Because if you think about it, you and I show up in a room, you've got a cup of coffee and I've got a cup of coffee, a notepad and a pen. It feels like a power imbalance.
Is she going to take notes? What's going on?
Exactly. That distrust happens. So what I love to say is, in conflict, this may sound silly, but it's so important. In conflict, we have to tell people what we think is obvious. So that's an example of the notes. Tell people what you think is obvious, because every time you do that, you are increasing the likelihood of trust happening in the room in that specific conversation.
Yeah. Oh, what a great point, right? Because so often conflict can happen because of just misperception, mis sort of interpretation of someone else's acts or what they said or what they meant, right? And just as you said, even the act of bringing the notebook, it's like, whoa, what is she doing with that? Is she taking notes to go tell our boss afterwards? So like you said, just explaining, hey, I get off track. I just wanted to make sure that, I could stay focused. And so that's the only reason I got my notes here, even flash them to the person, say, look, they're literally just like points that I've been thinking about that I want to make sure we cover,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
simple, right?
So
I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say two other little things that little things with big results that leaders can do. And these are actually really great skills for leaders to develop. Is number one is the power of asking questions, open-ended questions that start with who, what, where, when, why, and how. And when you can, there's a tendency when we're in conflict or in tough conversations, we actually bypass what we know to be true. We know that open-ended questions are really helpful. They elicit conversation, yet when under pressure, when there's high drama and we're uncomfortable, we revert to closed questions. Would you, could you, will you? So practice and help your team use open-ended questions, because that is what starts to unpack, as you were saying earlier, unpack what's really going on. And the second piece that's really, really helpful that leaders can do is help employees know how to get a conversation going. When I think about conflict and when I was a mediator, the two most important moments in a conversation are the bookends. The first 90 seconds and the last 90 seconds. How you begin and how you end shapes everything that happens in between and after. So teaching staff how to do things like statements of hope. So where I might say, Alex, I really want to thank you for taking time to talk with me today. I know we've got some things to work out. I really value the relationship you and I have together, and I know we can work this out. And that's an example of a statement of hope versus, oh, we better get to it, or what typically happens, the first 90 seconds of a conversation generally sound like this. So thanks, Alex, for talking to me. And you can just feel this discomfort. And what happens is discomfort just breeds more discomfort. So with my own discomfort, Alex is probably thinking, "Ooh, this must be a big issue. Like, she's really uncomfortable." And it's just it's inflaming. Whereas a statement of hope is just, I value our relationship and we'll get through this. We can figure it out together. I believe that.
Yeah. And I'll just say, hey, you said that statement to me, and we don't have a conflict, but just sort of role playing with you. I felt not just that there was hope there, but I felt that you valued me and that you valued our relationship. So automatically I found myself just thinking, okay, like I found myself opening up. Like if we were actually going to have that conversation, I felt my sort of my heart opening, my mind opening, and being like, oh, okay, like this really matters to her, and I matter. And so, okay, I'm listening.
Yeah,
Like
I'll
I'm
go with it.
willing participant now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love
Very,
that.
very few people are going to say to a statement of hope, no, I do not value you, and I do not. Very few people are going to respond that way.
Right.
So how will you set that stage in that first 90 seconds, and the last 90 seconds really goes a long way in resolution and relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know why, and maybe it's a very poor analogy, but as you've been talking about this sort of, people are avoidant of conflict, and that biggest hurdle is starting the conversation. What was coming to my mind was, it's kind of like going to the gym. Like, the hardest part is getting there, like convincing ourselves mentally that we, want to go to the gym. And like getting ourselves there. And once we're there, it's good and we feel great afterwards. And so like one of the ways people talk about sort of, hey, don't think about sort of the going there. Think about how you're going to feel afterwards, right? It's sort of an incentivizing strategy to psychologically get you there. So, you can tell me if that analogy is really bad, but the way I'm sort of thinking about it is, okay, if we know that people generally, like, their default is to avoid the conflict, and getting the conversation is really started is really hard. Are there strategies or sort of psychological workarounds where you can incentivize people and make them see sort of the benefit, right? Like the gym analogy, like think about the end goal, because that's what you really want, right? Are there any strategies like that, Charmaine?
Well, you have. Yes, and you've beautifully described what's so essential for conflict resolution. It's the mindset, because what we think about in our mind, whether we're present to it or not, what we think about shapes how we show up, what we say, and how we react or respond. Your thoughts, as you've identified, are critical. So if we go into a conflict and the mindset is, this is going to suck, this is going to be awful, the last time I had a conversation with him, it went off the trails and we ended up in a fight. If that's the mindset, that's the environment we bring into the room. And actually, it's almost like we will make that happen, even if that wasn't how the conversation was going. Likewise, if we start thinking, I'm afraid of this, or I don't have confidence, that's what we bring into the room. So when I used to mediate, I used to do a pre-mediation, and that was basically meeting with each party separately. And we would actually do work around this. And I would ask them questions. What is your BATNA? And a BATNA is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which basically means, what's the best thing that can happen from you having these conversations together? What does success look like to you? And what you're doing is you're changing the language, and you'll hear people say things, I just want to be heard, or I just need them to get my viewpoint, or, I just need to let that person know that what they said was not okay. And so what's happening is that that's a very different conversation than the previous mindsets. And the other tip around that is looking at the language that you're, the way in which you're saying things in your brain. For example, if you say, oh, this is going to be a difficult conversation, that's what we create. So instead of calling it a difficult conversation, what about calling it, this is an opportunity for us to clear the air, or this is an opportunity for us to both say what's on our hearts and minds right now.
I love it. Yeah. And what a sort of a 180 that is, to just frame it in that different way. So it's really about shifting our perceptions, shifting our perspective on it. I love it. I love it. So, and I want to be mindful of your time. I could talk about this forever, and you're giving amazing, actionable strategies here. What if I am, a leader who has a couple of employees there is a conflict that needs to be resolved, and I'm encouraging them to talk with one another. But maybe one of them is particularly resistant, and in that mindset of like, I don't want to talk to him. I mean, last time it was like a total disaster, and you know, he's such an a-hole or what, like
Yep.
they're stuck in the
Mhm.
story, they're stuck in the
Mhm.
conflict. What do I do as a leader in that situation, Charmaine? How do I
Oh,
turn that around so that I'm creating that space for the conversation to happen?
yeah, that's one of the most important questions for leaders, because they get trapped in what I call the supervisor triangle all the time,
Yep.
which is person A and person B have an issue with each other and they're not talking to each other. They're going to the supervisor separately.
Yep.
Supervisor has at best 30% of the information, most of which is not accurate. And
Right.
so what I have found is that first step is always to ask lots of questions. So what's preventing you from talking to that person? What's the best thing that could happen from having that conversation with the individual? What have you tried to resolve the conversation? So really getting them, instead of allowing them just to say, I'm not talking to them, you know, because part when we work on a team, there is a requirement that people work together. And so
Yeah.
if that is not working, the second piece might be coaching, you know. And so a leader might say, this issue is impacting both of you and or the team, and it really does need to be dealt with. So let's look at me coaching you on how to have this conversation. And if the person is really resistant, what I've helped leaders do is say, then I'm going to facilitate the dialogue with you both.
Mm.
And so this requires leaders to be mediator in a sense. So what is vital for this to be successful is the leader, if you're going to be facilitating a conversation with both people, you have to set up balance. And one way to do that is every time you ask one person a question, you ask the same question to the other party. So and the other piece that you're doing is you are asking open-ended questions to really help people understand what is going on, why does this exist, what's important to us, and what could help us together resolve this issue. And so the leader now is taking on the role of a facilitator, a mediator, not the decision maker, but guiding them through the conversation, helping them stay on track. You know, if one person cuts the other off, they're generally, if there's two people in the room, one of them tends to be more dominant or more interrupty, if that's a word.
Right.
And it's the leader's job in advance to kind of agree on some guidelines around how we can have this conversation respectfully. And if somebody is not playing by that agreement, the leader can address that, but not in a punitive way, but just in a way that we all agreed that we were going to communicate in this way so that we could all be heard. I'd like so-and-so to finish their statement first, then we're going to come back to you. So really balancing what we call power and the conversation. And then if that doesn't work, sometimes what's going on is not conflict. It's a performance issue. And this is the tough part for leaders, is determining, is this a conflict or is this a performance issue? And sometimes it becomes very obvious when that leader brings the parties together and one party is very willing and working hard at the conversation and the other party is just resistant and almost antagonizing the conversation. Often a leader might stop that then, and then the conversation is more with the leader and that particular individual. And you want to look at patterns, like, is this a pattern with that person? Has this happened with more than one individual? Because often, and this was my experience when I was a mediator, and I would kind of do some fact finding, I would hear leaders say, you know, this is not the first person that this individual has had disagreements with. And I'll say, you know, what do you mean? And it's like, well, every person. So that sometimes leads me to believe maybe it's not conflict at play here. Maybe it's a performance issue. And that's a different conversation.
Right. And recognizing that when it happens. Oh, beautiful. I love it. Wow, have you given us a lot. And you know what? True, I predicted it at the beginning. I said, this is going to be an episode you need to listen to more than once because it is so chock full. And I mean, I'm going to try to summarize, but I know I'll forget some. But one big theme here and an opener is questions.
Yes.
You know, don't assume because you're the leader that you have the answers or that, you know, you kind of know what's going on. It's like, ask those open-ended questions. you know, as you said, create that environment, help bring the perspective of, you know, what are the good things that could come from us actually, you know, dealing with this conflict? What could be like a best outcome? And then, you know, if you have to facilitate, setting those ground rules, keeping that balance in there, so that everybody feels like it's fair and equitable and no favoritism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you said, sort of being mindful that, hey, ultimately it might not be conflict. It might be a performance issue. And then of course that changes the dynamic and, you know, as you said, is a whole other conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes. I love it. Oh, Charmaine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
I feel like you have so much wisdom. We probably just barely scraped the surface here, but what you've shared has been tremendously valuable. I know our listeners are going to want more from you. So how can they get in touch with you? You know, how can they connect with you further? And I think you also have a very cool giveaway as well, right?
Absolutely. LinkedIn, Charmaine Hammond. You'll notice on my picture, my hair is a little shorter, but it's me. Charmaine Hammond on LinkedIn. And my website is charmainehammond.com. And what I would love to share with people, you can just send me a message through my website or LinkedIn. I have a brand new book out called Teams Working Better Together. It actually goes through a lot of what we talked about today around conflict resolution in more detail. So happy to share the PDF. And we just did a 3-part webinar series on working better together around returning to work with resilience and conflict resolution and working better together after a pandemic. So I'm happy to share the video series as well.
Oh, fantastic. I want access to those things, please. Like
you
have me on the edge of my seat. So I want those and, you know, people listening, I mean, take her up on this offer because you can hear how much, you know, experience, expertise Charmaine has and how much she has helped various organizations and leaders along the way. So take her up on this offer. Reach out to her, or if you know, for whatever reason you can't connect with her, you can connect with her through me. You can just shoot me a note at questions@positiveleadershipmovement.com and let me know that you want to get in touch with Charmaine and I can connect you that way too. So it's really been such a having Charmaine on the show. Thank you again. And
my pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us for another episode. If you have positive leadership stories to share, or you have questions about conflict resolutions, or you know, maybe how you dealt with it, you know, don't be shy. Share it. Send it to me at questions@positiveleadershipmovement.com. I always love to hear from you. All right, that's it for this week. This is Alex Bratty signing out and thanking you for being a part of the positive leadership movement and inspiring me to do what I do every single day.
Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you like this episode, please rate and review. If you want to get more from Alex, check out Happiness at Work, where she provides leaders with a proven path to cultivate a positive work culture that increases performance, productivity, and profitability. Go to happinessatworknow.com. Join us next week and harness the power of positive leadership for your organization.